Thank you for having me today to sort of talk about something that is very near and dear to me, which is working with the media. So just a little bit of history about myself. Again, my name is Stephen Buckner, and I've been at the Census Bureau now a little over 20 years. But my first job at the Census Bureau was a media partnership specialist. And that was during the 2000 census. And I was responsible for managing media relations activities, talking to reporters like yourselves, and educating them about what the 2000 census was for the state of Florida. And it was one of the most rewarding jobs that I had ever had, because it allowed me and afforded me the opportunity to go meet with every single media organization in a very diverse and complex state with a lot of different needs, from rural to urban to a lot of different languages and cultures. And it just also showed me the benefit of what the Census Bureau brings to local communities. So it was something that, from an intrinsic standpoint, you really got behind. And when I got the opportunity to go to headquarters, I said, absolutely, I'd love to be involved in this. I didn't think I'd be there for 20 years, but here it is, and it goes by very fast. But I say that to sort of set up that each and every one of you are going to leave this great training and go back to your normal jobs. And what I want to sort of communicate throughout that process is that there are people like me at a local level through our regional offices that can assist you with every single story, operational question that you might have, or connect you to what we call partners. These are the people that really make the census work on the ground in your local communities. Everybody can think of one voice in a community that is so trusted. If you go to that person and they say, yes, the census is safe, all fear is removed, right? Because I'm going to trust that person. We call those third-party influencers. They're also called partners, and they're all over the place during the census. Many of them are in the shape of a governmental body that comes together, usually formed by the highest elected official I'll talk a little bit about later, called complete count committees. Those are ramping up in your communities right now. It's a great way to get involved. So as I go through this presentation, I'm really trying to approach it to some of the questions that I always got when I was out in the field working with each of your organizations, so that you walk away with things that are tangible to sort of follow up on, in addition to sort of telling you where we're going from a communication standpoint. So hopefully that will set up the talk a little bit. I think it's important before we start also just to note that I'm going to talk about what we say is the paid communications part of the Census Bureau. And this is all geared towards everything from paid advertising to public relations to congressional intergovernmental affairs activities to working in our nation's school systems, and then forming those local partnerships that I talked about with key community organizations, elected officials, national organizations at every single level, to maximize awareness, because the census only takes place once a decade. And as you heard from Margot yesterday, a lot of people forget what the census is and whether or not they participated. So we did a lot of research to understand how people's mindsets are in today's environment versus where it was in the 2010 census. So we've only been doing a paid advertising campaign since the 2000 census. Up until then, we relied heavily on public service announcements. Those wonderful things that get aired right around 1 and 2 a.m. in really strategic time slots were wonderful. Well, the problem is that we were facing a 3-decade decline in mail response rates, starting in the 1970 census, leading up to the 2000 census. And Congress and the Census Bureau said, you know what, we got to change the game a little bit. So we put forward a proposal to say we need to have a paid advertising program to help support and increase awareness and see if we can't stop this 3-decade decline. As a result of not only a great design from the 2000 census, but also all the hard work from our partners and the paid advertising, we were actually able to halt that 3-decade decline and maintain a 65% response rate. And that's important because every 1 percentage point increase in the self-response rate saves a lot of taxpayer money. Back in the 2000 census, I believe it was $65 million, and in the 2010 census, it was $85 million. So there's a real cost-benefit analysis there to make for educating people about why the census is easy, why it's important, and why it's safe. And that was the big message we carried forward into the 2010 census. So I don't have the clicker, so I guess
It's off the top of the podium there. That's it.
I'll press the green button. Thank you. So this slide is really meant to try to walk you through, when we talk about an integrated communications program, what are we really talking about? So I'll start at the 10 o'clock time frame there, on the advertising and media buying, because I just sort of talked about that. Most people associate communications just to the advertising program. For the 2020 census, we have over a $500 million campaign that will be looking at not only paid advertising, but each and every one of these little circles. And if you see in the middle those individual bodies, we are trying to reach every single person. But also a key component of what we're trying to do with the 2020 census communications efforts are reaching those hard-to-count populations that are historically missed or undercounted. Now, to explain an undercount, or people that are less likely to participate in the census, I want to set it up a little bit differently than how you might think about it. A person's likeliness to respond to the census are based on characteristics that somebody might have. Can anybody guess what those characteristics might be?
Distrust in government.
Distrust in government, certainly. Education is highly correlated to whether or not somebody responds. High school or less is less likely to respond than obviously somebody with a college or an advanced degree. What's another one? Age. Age less so, but I heard language. Language absolutely is a huge barrier in terms of breaking through, because it also means it's based on place of origin sometimes. They may not have an understanding of the census. The census could have been used against them in the country that they came from. Anyone else? Income or poverty. Huge characteristic factor in terms of whether or not somebody's likely to respond. Housing status. Renters are less inclined to respond than homeowners. They're more established in the community. Renters tend to move a little bit more, so the mobile population throws in there. So I say that because the characteristics of those people that are less likely to respond, they occur a little bit more frequently in some of our racial and ethnic minorities. But those same characteristics in a white population will give you a very similar likelihood to respond. It's really the characteristics that drive somebody whether to respond, the circumstances they're in. So I say that because as we approach communications, we're looking at how do we reach various communities, but we take into account these factors to sort of drive where our work might be going. So public relations and events, you will see a lot of local activities going on in your communities trying to increase awareness about what the census is and whether or not you should participate. Those are homegrown events. Some will be census-sponsored events. Some may be a local mayor coming forward and trying to raise awareness in their communities because they understand the impact of what the census is. Remember, it's about power and it's about money. You get your political representation from the census, and you get over $675 billion every single year back from the federal government to state and local governments for things like schools, roads, hospitals, healthcare clinics, job training centers, etc. Statistics in schools. We have a statistics in schools program that's in the classrooms right now. It's all online. We have a great website. I encourage you to take a look at it. There's a lot of curriculum that you can actually teach in the classrooms. We'll be ramping that up for the 2020 census, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. We've already heard a lot about some of the field recruitment activities. I will show you a little bit of the advertising that we're doing right now in sort of the phase one of the recruiting phase to drive people to apply for the jobs. And I think one of the key components, the stakeholder relations and partnership program, everybody seems to care about the census at some point from a stakeholder community. In the now 3 censuses I'm going to be involved in, I have never seen a more heightened sense of urgency or coming together from our stakeholder community at this point in the decade. It started over 2 years ago, and that's unparalleled. So community organizations, philanthropic organizations, coming together say, how are we going to make sure our state, our local community gets an accurate count? And that's key because we can do everything we can from an operational standpoint. We are going to conduct the census. I'll walk through a great operational plan, and we're going to get to every single household, and we're going to do the non-response. But we still can't do it without the local people, the local census. It is the people's census. We just conduct it. So that's really key to some of the things. And then new for this particular census are the digital and the social media components. And that's something that we've really started to. So believe it or not, in January of 2010, we launched our Facebook page. it was only 2007 that some of these platforms had come in. It seems like it's been ages ago, but Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, YouTube, you name it. Those are all platforms that we now have to work with to connect to a very connected community in an age where information may not necessarily be accurate across those formats. And we need your help and our partners' help to make sure that when we see that information that doesn't make sense or doesn't look like it's right, to help us combat that, to help us push back and say, no, that's not what the census is doing. And so this is all part of an integrated program that we really need your help and our local partners' help to communicate with the local community to get an accurate count. So I mentioned the sort of contract side of it, the $500 million campaign. Team Y&R is our communications agency of record. They're New York-based advertising agency, global, and there's a lot of other logos up here. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time explaining what that is. Now, coincidentally, Y&R actually had the 2000 campaign. There are a few people that actually remember that still at Y&R. In fact, one of them is working on the account. But Y&R is set with everything from paid advertising to the public relations activities to helping us align the Statistics in Schools program, to really help us coordinate across the Census Bureau headquarters and our 6 regional offices to put forward the best messaging that we can to break down the barriers that people may have to wanting to participate in the census. And I'm going to talk about some of that research briefly. But with each one of these firms, I want to sort of tell you where their lead audience is. So this is a list. We have a really good set of firms that are really diving into specific audience groups. So Culture One World is responsible for the U.S.-based Hispanic audience. Carol H. Williams on the Black and African American. That also includes a Caribbean population and some of the other orgs under that. American Indian Alaska Native, G&G, is actually, this will be their 3rd census. They've actually been associated with each of the 3 paid advertising campaigns, and they're responsible both for American Indian but also Alaska Native audience population groups. Kalamaku is responsible for Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders, which is not just in Hawaii. There's a population across the U.S. as well, so we have to hit the mainland population as well. TDW and Company is responsible for the Asian population across all the different ethnicities within that group. Y&R, we call something called diverse mass. So diverse mass is any customer or consumer that is responding consumes English language media. So that's English language media. This is not, diverse mass is not just, oh, this is the white population advertising. This is anybody that consumes general programming in English. So, and then Puerto Rico, we have Y&R San Juan that's also represented. And so I mention that because as you learn more and more about the campaign, each one of these multicultural agencies are focused in on their specific audience. Some of that, the majority of that, is in language audience groups. Illustrated by CDW, they'll have multiple languages within the Asian population that they're responsible for reaching out to, both from a paid and an earned media standpoint, to make sure the population knows that it's safe to participate in the census, that it's important for their community to participate in the census. Whereas the diverse mass is all-encompassing. It's everybody in this room. So it's a very diverse program with no single target except for you consume English media. So the languages covered by the campaign are a total of 13, 12 languages other than English. And this is consistent with what we had during the 2010 census, although we did receive money from the American Recovery Act, which actually boosted some of the language outreach that we had, but these are the same core languages that we had, and these are also the same languages that are covered by the self-response instrument that Al talked about a little bit earlier. Now, it's important to note that we don't stop here. So language outreach is central to our local partnership program. I don't recall the actual number, but we can find this out from field, but I think they spoke over 100 and something languages in the 2010 census, reaching out to local communities. Now, what is a partnership specialist? I'll go into what partnership is a little bit later, but let me just set the stage. It is hiring people within various communities, hard-to-count communities across the country that have special skills to reach individual communities from a grassroots outreach standpoint. And they may speak a certain language or have a specific skill, but it is hiring from within the hard-to-count communities to make sure they help ensure, working along with the elected officials, the community organizations, ensure an accurate count in that local area. But these are the languages that are covered. The overall campaign will also have 59 language assistance guides that was mentioned earlier. That includes videos in those language on how to fill out your form in those languages. So really extensive. This is the largest language covered campaign. It was in 2010, and again, it'll be the largest outreach campaign the government's undertaken to date. So massive undertaking, a lot of money being thrown at this. How do we know what we're doing is right? And it all starts with research. And we fielded something called the Census Barrier Attitudes and Motivators Study about 1.5 years ago. We did one in 2010 census as well, but we expanded the reach of that study. It was a 50,000 household sample, representative sample across the country. So that was the quantitative part. We had 42 qualitative focus groups scattered across various audiences across the country in language and in different ethnicities. We had about a 39% response rate to that survey, which is unheard of in most survey taking. We at the census like it. But we actually had 4 times as many responses to the 2020 CBAMs that we fielded compared to 2010, which used a different methodology. But the 2010 campaign, we based on 4,000 interviews. We have over 39,000 quantitative alone, and we didn't do focus groups in 2010. So we've actually got a lot more understandings about what are the people's gaps that they might have, which is that center column. So obviously it only happens once every 10 years. So there's a general lack of knowledge about what is the census, why should I care about it? It's in the Constitution, had no idea. So there's a lot of feedback that we get out of that survey. It talks about the barriers. I think I've had questions that were asked today and yesterday that got at each one of these barriers. But we know there's a growing mistrust of government. We know people are fearful of how the data might be used against them, regardless if it's census data. And they don't understand the benefits. Why is it important to them? Why should I care about filling out a census? It doesn't do any good, right? So there's all of those in terms of barriers that sets up somebody's mindset as to whether or not they should participate in the census. And through this survey, we also explored what were some of the key motivating factors. And you wouldn't be surprised to find, but understanding that their local community got federal funding from the state and local governments every year based on census population data, when they connected those two things and they saw that their actual one voice could make a difference in this country or in their local community, it was a very powerful, powerful message. When we then further linked it to some of the things that the communities actually would frequent, hospitals, health clinics, job training centers, roads, all of those things are based on population data. And so when we start linking those things, the business case starts making itself. But the key point, and I'll keep coming back to this, we as the government can only say so much that is going to be trusted regardless of our intent. It is the local trusted partner, an elected official or community organization or pastor or teacher, whoever it might be, has to carry that message for the census for it to be truly successful at the local level to increase self-response rates. So on this research findings, this is one slide out of over a 30-page deck that we have available. And I actually marked it so that I could come back to it for you guys. We have something called program management reviews that Al and his team did out of the decennial directorate that we did on a quarterly basis over the last 2 years. An immense amount of background understanding for you and your colleagues to take a look at when you have questions. There is a deck on CBAMs, as we call it, the Barrier Attitude Motivator Study, that walks through a lot of this data and gives you a better understanding of the research, because this does not do it justice. But we had to understand the research to build the campaign. So out of the research, we then start taking a look at the individual population characteristics that we could aggregate together into like-minded segments. And we call these mindsets. And we broke it up into these groups I'll read them out. So eager engagers. So who are those? And 80, yeah, somebody raise their hand. Yes. Yeah, everybody should have raised their hand. I'm not sure why. We'll come back to that at the end of the presentation. Maybe we can boost the response rate. So about 19% of the population, when we pulled all these like characteristics together, fell into this eager engagers. These are the people that typically are heavily engaged in civic responsibility. They vote. People that are actually, you just need to remind them and tell them something, and they're going to do it. They abide, mostly by what the government tells you to do. They do it. They're very compliant. If you think about the Midwest, a lot of that would be the eager engagers. They have higher response rates coming out of the Midwest than in other states. Fence sitters, 32. So a third of the population are on the fence, meaning they may have some familiarity with the census, they may not. What is this thing? Do I have to do it? So you have to try to reach them in certain ways, right? But they had a 71% intent to respond. Confidentiality minded. We already talked about that. This has been a growing group. We had a segment in the 2010 census that we called the cynical fifth. So over 20% of the population, regardless of what we're going to do, we're very cynical and might not, we're not likely to respond to the census at all. We knew we were going to have to catch them during the non-response follow-up. Perfect. That's the disconnected doubters. And right now you can see that's about 10% of the population combined with the worry skeptics. That's about 14% of the population. So right around that same combined cynical fifth that we sort of combined when we had 5 of those segments. And then lastly, the head nodders in the bottom left, which had a 60% intent to respond, representing about 9% of the U.S. population. And the head nodders are sort of the ones, yeah, I get it. And then they sort of keep nodding their heads, and you got to probe a little bit. So I say this in the sense that the intent to respond for CBAMs, I believe, was 61% of the overall population had an intent to respond. Or is it 67? I'm sorry, 67% was an intent to respond. In the 2010 census, that intent was 77. It was 10% higher. Intent is not actual behavior. So what do we know from the 2010 census? The response rate was right around 63.5%, 64%, somewhere in that time frame. So it was about 10% less than the intent. So taking that into accord, we've projected a response rate at 61%. That's or 60.5. I'm sorry, right? 60.5% response rate for the 2020 census. So we're right in that range, but if we follow the 10% from 2010, we might be below that. So we got our work cut out for us.
Why is it, do you have any reasons as to why the intent would have decreased over the last decade?
There's a lot of survey research on sort of the intent to do things versus the actual behavior patterns. And people, when asked a question, they're more likely to say yes, they will do something than they actually will. Sort of like that solicitor that comes to your door and says, hey, will you do this? And, oh, yeah, okay, thanks, I'm going to go back to dinner. So there's some of that. But about a 10% drop-off from 2010. We'll see where it's at and be able to measure a little bit more. But there's more into this sort of recency theory and other things that go into it in our survey research, and I can give you that deck after.
Are there any sort of changes, societal changes that make people less likely to respond now than?
I got you. Okay, thank you. Great question. So the question was, just to repeat it out, was are there other factors today that may have grown from the 2010 census that would lead somebody to be less likely? Yeah, the population's grown. It's become more and more diverse. There are more languages spoken. We are a much more mobile population. We live in a 24/7 news environment and social media where information clutter is at an all-time high. So trying to break through this busy thing. Many people are working more than one job, trying to make ends meet. So trying to break through all of that, any marketer or communications person will tell you about the challenges they're having trying to keep their customer base motivated to have that transaction. But those things keep doing. And as the nation becomes more diverse, as it becomes more mobile, again, we used to be very situated. We would stay in the same hometown. That's not the case anymore. So when you deal with that, you deal with a lot more of the factors. Yes, in the back.
Are you concerned about millennials at all? Because this age, like, they're not used to male. We were talking about age before in response, and like, millennials are like, they're on their phones, they're on Facebook, Twitter, whatever, and Instagram. It's not about what they're getting in the mail. Is there concern in how to reach a population of the United States now that doesn't respond in the normal traditional way?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of studies on the millennials and sort of their engagement activities. they really need to have the understanding and the personal feeling that they are going to make that difference, that it will mean something. Having an online option is going to be key here. The fact that they can simply do it as they're going to work on a bus or on the metro. They could do it sitting on the couch while they're, Netflixing and doing whatever else they want to do, right? So there's an ability to be able to quickly, okay, somebody got the reference. So there's this concept within millennials called adulting. Who's heard of adulting before? It's phenomenal, right? It's this badge that they feel like they get for taking this further step to adulthood that perhaps some of us said, wait a minute, that's just being 18 or over. But no, it's a celebration now. That is actually quite interesting. So we're going to capture a lot of that, I think, in the advertising and the outreach. But I think, again, given the options and how we're going to be able to get the instrument out there for people to respond is a huge difference in this campaign versus others. Because we did a great job in 2010. We would fire you up at a local parade, a local event, a great ad, and then we say, okay, now go home, find that questionnaire somewhere on the kitchen counter, and fill it out. So you lost all the momentum. Today, as Al was saying, or maybe Burton mentioned, hey, okay, everybody, get out your phone right now. We're doing the census. Or some of our partners are even talking about providing a laptop or a tablet at their point of business and saying, no, we're going to take it in our own hands. Everybody come to X place, 9 o'clock. We're going to help fill out your census. Right? So there's a lot more engagement and ability to be able to do that this time around than in the last one.
Just want to have a quick reminder that the oldest millennials are in their late 30s now.
Yes.
So they've been adulting for a while,
Yeah.
and a lot of them have mortgages and homes and children, present company excluded. But it's important to remember that millennials, especially for reporters, are not like tweens or teens
No.
at all anymore, and that they're actually filling out the census, and a lot of them are quite established.
Yeah. So funny, I'm going to reference census data here, right? So millennials is actually not a true age group within the census data. In fact, we were just dealing with Wikipedia yesterday because they asked, hey, can you explain what the millennial age groups are? And so we put them in with our population group to talk about the age structures, and then it's not a recognized necessarily group like the baby boomers. We gave them sort of the age groups. Gen Z is really sort of this next phase of the millennials that will take it. But some millennials are young enough to where this will be their first census on their own. Or they may be a sibling to somebody that has never done it before. So there is still sort of that influence. Younger people are harder to find. They're more mobile. And so that adds to the complexity of it as well. But with this census, now you have an older population that may not want to fill it out online. So they may want the paper, which is the genius behind making sure every single household, regardless of whether you're not, will get a paper questionnaire at the end of the day so that people feel comfortable responding. We have a great infographic that we just released last week, I believe. It's on our social media pages as well as on our infographic page that walks through how we get people to respond and when they will actually get a questionnaire.
Yeah, this may also overlap with our previous session, but I'm curious because I know there are certain people who argue that the only constitutional requirement of the census is for the apportionment question, and with a paper ballot, you could obviously, if they so choose, just fill out the, how many people are in this house and send that in without answering any sort of subsequent questions related to demographics. For people filling out on the internet or via some sort of app, will there be an ability to send in partially completed forms, or will it only accept fully completed forms?
Yeah, so I'm gonna answer it a couple different ways, and if any of my colleagues want to jump in at some point, if they need to, or even Margot perhaps, I would say that in previous censuses, if you didn't answer a question, you were more likely to get a return visit by a census taker, but not a guarantee, right? So we absolutely need the count of the population. All the other questions were mandated by Congress. We submitted our questions. They said, yes, these are the questions you're going to ask in the census, and each of those questions is mandated by law. When you think about what questions we ask on today's census, it is less information than you put on a credit card application. And we protect the data, unlike other organizations that don't. So we make that case. We talk about the benefits to the organizations or the individuals that are raising those questions about how those simple questions really do help guide your local decision maker, your business communities, to understand what's going on within their population. So I say that to set up that is typically what we try to say to people. If you don't fill it out completely, you run the risk of somebody having to come to your door to collect the rest of the information. That is the same story, I will tell you, on the internet side. However, yes, you will be able to go on the internet instrument, and if you don't answer a question, you'll get a couple prompts, and then you'll move on to the next question. Again, if you don't fill it out completely, though, we may send somebody out to your house, but it's not a guarantee. So hopefully that addresses the question. You guys, yes, sir. Sorry, we're rapid fire. I love it.
You just said each question has been mandated by law. Do they have to be mandated by law?
The census by nature is mandated by law.
Well, what I mean
In
is
the
you said
Census
each
Act.
question is. You said each question
Each
is.
question we propose, we send it to Congress for their approval to ask, and they, I think John's
I've got
wanting
a
to jump
mic.
in.
So Congress doesn't approve the questions. The Census Bureau sends them to Congress. Congress has to act to
Yes.
not approve the questions. So Congress does not approve the questions. The Census Bureau, in conjunction with the Department of Commerce, has responsibility for determining the content of the census. And they do that through consultations
Sure.
with other federal agencies to determine a federal purpose. For the short form questionnaire, most of the information is due to enforce civil rights, voting rights, and things like that. There's other uses, but that's sort of like the primary use. But census is required by law to send in the topics 3 years in advance of the census, and they send in the actual questions 2 years. The Congress has to take some kind of action to overturn that.
Thanks, John.
How does that relate to the issue of the citizenship question then?
Maybe we can talk about that later when I do my thing on the undercount. Okay, but the Census Bureau, the Secretary of Commerce, decided that he was going to add a citizenship question based on a request that Ron Jarman, the acting director, got from the Department of Justice.
Can an individual, or let's say the president, sue the census to obtain information or census data such as names and addresses of undocumented immigrants, or can such lawsuit prosper actually?
Okay. So we get a lot of questions, particularly within a lot of our partner organizations, about how can we assure the confidentiality of the data, which I think gets to the heart of your question, Don. Title 13, which is the census law, protects your personal information from being shared and with any government agency, and that includes any elected official. We take a lifetime oath as a census employee to protect that information, and will not willfully disclose that information under penalty of law of a $250,000 fine or 5-year imprisonment. The courts have upheld Title 13 in multiple cases. We had a question around the Patriot Act and whether or not that would trump Title 13 following 9/11, and the courts upheld it and said no. Title 13 cannot be preempted by the Patriot Act. So it has been proven up to this point to be a very strong privacy confidentiality law.
No lawsuits or FOIA can ever.
No, your personal information is protected for 72 years. There is an interesting case, Margot, you may have the actual year, but there was a president, a Secret Service detail. Do you remember the president? Where he was looking for a house?
Steve is right. I mean, the confidentiality protection as we know it today was in the law from 1929. It was repealed for 5 years during the Second World War in statute, right?
Mm-hmm.
And as a result, in statute, during the Second World War, all data from the Census Bureau, microdata, economic, demographic, was available to all the other agencies of government for use in connection with the prosecution of the war. Once the Second War Powers Act expired, the 1929 statutory language was restored. So that's the one example in the 20th century that we have on this. And as I said, there's, evidence of that I've written and others have written about exactly what was done during that period. Can I say one other thing on this, that it used to be, Steve's right, it used to be that Congress actually sat in session and wrote the census statute and the questions, right? Through the 1920s, they did that. Why did they do that? Well, it turns out that we didn't have a permanent Census Bureau until 1902. So someone had to do it, and it was Congress. As I said yesterday, by the 20s, Congress realized, we could get the agency to do that, and they ceded the responsibility for the questionnaire design and the actual questions to the director and the Commerce Secretary, which is the current procedure. And the 3-year and the 2-year notification requirements to Congress were put in a statute in 1976. So again, it's a background.
In the interest of time and because he has more slides, let's go through the rest of his presentation, and that'll hold time before 1 o'clock, which still will keep us on our agenda for the additional questions.
Great. Thank you. So yesterday, was that yesterday? Monday, we rolled out what our communications platform was going to be. Now, a platform, so all that research I just talked to you about, where we're trying to learn what might motivate people to pay attention to the census, to respond to the census. We started working with our advertising agency to break those mindsets down a little bit further. And then they came together with their multicultural firms and with the census team and said, okay, what are some of the themes, the taglines, the type of campaign that we want to run? And we probably came up with 15, 20 different platforms, and they started kicking them around. They started trying to figure out, okay, does it apply to this audience group? Does it resonate with this audience group? Does it communicate the benefits and reduce some of the barriers that we saw in the research? And we actually went out and did some testing on a couple different concepts, and this one came out really ahead of the other ones. And then we went back and said, okay, across the multicultural audience groups, will it transcreate well? Meaning, does the meaning mean something across all the different ethnicities within the diverse America that we live in today? And Shape Your Future, Start Here did that. It's a build off of this being an online, the chevron gives you this feeling that, okay, I'm supposed to do something. You click here and I start. That the census starts with you simply answering a couple of questions. That you can make a difference by starting here, that your community can start moving forward by starting here. And so this is right out of our style guide that we have posted on our website today. Over the next several weeks, you'll see this creative platform trans-adapted into all the languages of the actual campaign. We're going through validation of those languages and the translation of them to make sure that they meet all of the different ethnicity and languages that are supported by the campaign, those 12 that I talked about. And those will be coming out well ahead of April 1st, which is Census Day. Okay? So here's a high-level timeline. So really happy to be talking to actual reporters, but the other side of your business, which some of you may also be doing on the business side, wants to know when the advertising is going to kick off and how can I find out more about maybe getting a buy from the contract. So this timeline, the section 1 just talks about all the different things that we were doing that led up to the creative, to the testing of the creative and the campaign. All of the platform and the ads that we've been developing off of that platform are going into a series of focus groups across the country. We're going to be testing whether or not they resonate within different populations. Out of that, we could scrub some, we could bring some new ones in, we might change them up or decide to go back to the drawing board if it didn't hit a particular audience group. That's all going to take place this spring. From a business standpoint, we have a media vendor day. A release is going out today from Y&R that will announce that it is going to be holding a media vendor day to answer any and all questions about how to get advertising dollars. How can you put forward a proposal to solicit some advertising dollars for your local media or national media? And that's really large because sometimes people don't know that this is going on. So we're really trying to make sure it's very clear. If you want to participate in the media buy, you really need to start paying attention to it now that they're going to start reviewing proposals. The upfront media negotiations begin later this May. Upfront media negotiations is the opportunity for big advertisers to enter into an upfront market to purchase advertising space the following year at a heavy discount and premium placement. So you save anywhere between 30 and 40% on your advertising dollars by going into the upfront buy. So we will spend a portion of our advertising money in that upfront buy so that we get prime placements, efficient buys, and what we like to call sort of added value. So this is where media properties will come to you and say, look, yeah, you buy one ad, I'm going to give you another 5 for free. Or, hey, I'll give you an event tie-in at this sporting event if you purchase on my property. So these are all added value type things that advertisers love to talk about, but we love it because it gives a taxpayer more money, more efficiency for the money that we're spending to reach the country. The rest of the activities, you'll see here up in the upper box of 3, that's really the time frame. So in early January, we will start advertising in some groups. Some of the multicultural work will actually start airing in January. We will then start hitting the diverse mass a little bit later. A lesson learned from 2010, we actually peaked too soon. We peaked about 2 weeks ahead of when the first mailer got there. And so we were starting to suffer a little burnout on the advertising. So we learned from that. So we're starting a little bit on a different schedule to maximize that, but also because of the immediacy of the digital, where once we start advertising digitally, you can click on it and go straight to the response option. So that's something else that we're really excited about. But that's sort of the time frame. The motivation phase really coincides with the mailing of the questionnaire, the postcard, and the invitations to respond. That's really when the call to action is going to start hitting you big time. Fill out your census. It's important. Shape your future. And so that'll be heavy in the motivation phase across probably early May. And then we'll go into more of the reminder phase. Now, an interesting thing that we learned out of the 18 Providence test is that historically with the census, once we cut for non-response follow-up, meaning we said, okay, if you didn't respond by a certain date, we're sending a census taker to your door to get you counted. And then a census taker would knock on the door and said, I just mailed it back. I already filled it out. And they're, well, sorry, you got to fill it out again. I'm here. We don't have a record for you. And so that process sometimes doesn't lead to a great customer experience, right? So if I already filled it out, don't come see me. Well, because of the digital component here and because the decennial is using more real-time data, we'll be able to narrow that window. So if you respond, we'll be able to, remember how Al talked about real-time case assignments to the fieldwork? So if somebody responds, within a day or two, we should be able to remove that caseload to where somebody doesn't go to a house they don't need to go to. But more importantly, out of the 18 tests, we found out when a census taker went to the door and left a little reminder on the door, amazingly, somebody filled out the form online or they mailed it back. I think it was a 10%, 2%, 2 to 3% bump, but that's huge when you're trying to shrink 30 million households that aren't responding to the census. So that's a big difference. So having the ability to respond after it, I think will be really key to some of the work that we're doing. So that's sort of the timeline of when you'll start seeing paid advertising. Now, I talked about the recruitment advertising. We talked a little bit about jobs. These are some of the ads that are in rotation right now. You'll see a change in those ads as we really go into peak advertising. This was a lot of the early advertising work. You can go in USA Jobs. If you're following us on social media, you'll see some social media ads coming at you or reminders to tell people, hey, if you're looking at ready to pick up some good paying jobs, temporary work, this is one of the ways that we can do it. I mentioned a little bit about statistics in schools. This is our website to sort of give you an idea of what it is, but you can you can get activities out of it. There's a lot of resources for teachers. If you want to learn more, they have history lessons, they have math lessons, they have geography lessons. It's a fantastic site. This is the evergreen program, what we say outside of the census years. This is what's those other 9 years we have something in place because statistical literacy is a big campaign for the Census Bureau. This is also a program that a lot of the local leaders really want to get involved in. They love going into the classrooms and explaining to our young minds what is the census, why it's important. And it comes to find out kids are actually really good motivators too when they go home and nag at mom or dad or whoever and say, hey, you got to fill out the census. My teacher told me to fill it out. So that's also a good motivating factor. This is sort of the timeline of what we'll be doing in terms of the schools and the roadmap. We will be getting out letters to all the superintendents and then the principals later in the late summer time frame. We'll tease it in the spring before they go on summer break, but then we'll send interested parties the big packet and what they can do to actually get census in schools in the classrooms to support the 2020 census. Now the partnership program, so Burton is actually leading our partnership program from a communication standpoint. There's two different components of it. There's one where we're working with all our national organizations. That could be a Fortune 500 business. It could also be a community organization, a philanthropic organization, a sports organization. Those are the real other federal agencies. Those are national level. And the intent there is to create as much awareness and education about the census, because we've seen a direct correlation. If you increase somebody's awareness, they're more likely to respond. So that's all part of this national umbrella. And I said the $500 million campaign like it was a big number. There's a lot more resources outside of census than inside. And so from a national standpoint, imagine what getting in on a little bit of a teaser from an Apple or Google or a local Ford dealer or another organization, you can think of any of them, that actually penetrates and sends all their internal employees, hey, don't forget to fill out the census. It's a real big motivating factor. I'll talk a little bit about it, but we got nationwide partnerships. The solution workshops and toolkits, these are online. These are online and very easy to use. Anybody familiar with design thinking? All right, so we had one or two. So design thinking is sort of let's call it brainstorming, right? So you bring different organizations together and you give them a problem statement. And in a short amount of time, set up by sprints, 15 minutes at a time, and it's a very, very disciplined process, you come out with an amazing amount of ideas and implementation steps to solve that problem. It's used a lot in the creative world, but it's working its way into businesses more and more. And we've had great success with these solution workshops going into local communities to talk about the census or a challenge that they have, undercount of children, reaching particular groups. And they've been fascinating. We have 7 examples up on our website, and we have a toolkit that local communities actually can participate. Well, we've had actual media participate in some of these in the past, and they absolutely love them. So there are some resources on our national. We talked about the local partnership. Local partnership, we have 1,500 that we're hiring by June. These are real community influencers, some media specialists. So when you go back home, we're going to get you a list of somebody in each of the 6 regional offices that you can follow up with for local media contacts. So that's one action item you have. There is a media specialist in a lot of different markets. We'll be in at least the top 40 DMAs, but they'll cover all of the media markets. So there will be something and somebody that speaks the language to do interviews with you or set up opportunities with local partners about how they're getting engaged in their local town. There's also complete count committees, which I'm going to talk about. And the one thing there is these groups usually have a media sub-team of which you can get and expose your expertise to ensure your community from more of a volunteer standpoint. But the local partnership, they're focused on how do we reach hard-to-count communities, how do we get those to count, how do we bring different partners and businesses and organizations together to commit to trying to get the word out about why it's important. These are just a range of some of the national partners. I'm going to skip over this, but we had over, what was the number, Burton, on national partners?
Oh, at this point we have about 85.
Yeah, we got about 85 now, but we had, a couple hundred in 2010. So I think we're in there. We had over 250,000 local partners in the 2010 census. So just a massive grassroots operation. Here's where we have state complete count committees. This is really critical. These are where states are actually investing their time and their resources to bring people together to solve how are we going to make sure their state get it accurate. Most of the time, a governor appoints somebody to chair it, and then they bring a diverse group across their state together to work up action plans and commitments on how best to reach. So one of the other action items you have is who's your complete count committee chair in your state that you might be able to reach out to find out what's going on locally that you want to cover, or maybe what the state does. They also are bringing money to bear. So California has offered up over $90 million they're going to put towards the 2020 census campaign. And other states are doing maybe not as much. California is a very large state, but there are other states that are coming forward with money as well. So those are all things you want to take a look at when you go back. There's a state, and then there's also local, and there's a guidebook. So if there's not one in your community, if you want to take it more on a social responsibility standpoint, probe your local official and say, hey, why aren't we doing a local complete count committee? And this handbook walks you through how to establish it and what type of work you actually should be doing. This is a phenomenal tool. You love maps, you're going to love this. So our geography division and research area pulled together all of the historical response rates from the census and then interlined it with all of the socioeconomic demographic data from the American Community Survey and came up with this response outreach area mapper. It goes down to census tract with anticipated likelihood to respond scores. So you can very quickly see in this mapping tool where your hardest to count neighborhoods are. And then you can see the composition of those that neighborhood area so that you can then effectively gear up tactics to reach that local community. And so we're getting great interaction and engagement with our local partnership program and our complete count committees because this tool really does tell you, hey, this is what we're expecting. Here's how some of the things you might want to look at trying to fix. I've been talking about it throughout. We have a website on how to get involved. These are a couple of things we're going to be asking your local community leaders and businesses to do. How do we get involved? Well, first of all, you can sign up. Everybody should be on our email distribution list. We put all our news releases out through that. We get a lot of other information out there. Some of them are story ideas. We send a lot of trends. Just today, we talked about how we were doing local partnership activities. We released something the other day where we were talking about poverty among the Hispanics being the lowest it was to date. So there's a lot of information that comes out of our email. There's also a way to actually share all the information on social media. You should be following our Facebook and Twitter feeds. We have a LinkedIn page that's really good too about jobs. So these are all ways that you can find out more and more about what's going on around the census. General website, this is going to be our focal point for how do we get information out to everybody. So this should be bookmarked. We're going to launch, we've launched it already, but it's going to undergo a lot of transformation over the next 6 months. We really haven't started scaling it to what we want to have it for the actual count. So more and more materials as we generate them out of the contract will be here to where you can take materials and do something with it. There's featured resources, what to expect. We even have a countdown clock. You can embed that on your websites if you want. And then lastly, the real exciting part here from a communication standpoint is we're going to be monitoring all sorts of things from a communication standpoint on not only our ad performance, but response rates and things that we at Census might be able to do working with our partners to increase in response rates in areas that are not at the levels we thought they would do. So we will have propensity models down to the census tract or at least census tract level that tells us what we expect the response rate to be. And if it's above that, great. We know we're doing really well there. But if it starts to fall behind for some reason, we're going to work with our partners and mine into that data to say, okay, what's going on? Is there some kind of misinformation that's going on in that local community? Who do we have as a local partner? Who's our media contact down there we might be able to reach out to and challenge people to respond to the census? So understanding real-time data as we get it through the systems and then changing our communications program will be groundbreaking. We'll be taking steps that no other government agencies have taken in terms of communication outreach and using data to make those decisions. So really exciting about that. And with that, here are all the ways that you could do it. The information series here, the 2020 Census website, those program management reviews, there is a great deck on how we use operations to reach the hard-to-count population. You should absolutely take a look at that. I actually have the date on that one. That was Marianne Chapin from October 19th of 2018 on the Program Management Review website of the Census Bureau. Because most people think it's the communications job to count the hard to count. No, it's our job to increase awareness and get people to try to respond to the hard to count. But ultimately, we've designed a census to do the same thing through all of our operations. So it's working together, both from an operational standpoint and a communication standpoint, to really try to reduce any kind of differential undercount among hard to count populations. And with that, whatever time we have left for questions. Thank you.
Thanks. Hi. So you mentioned the response outreach area mapper,
Yep.
and I was just taking a look at that. And so it seems to, as you were saying, provide the predicted non-response rate for each census tract. I was wondering, do you also publish, like, if, you know, say for 2010, what the actual non-response rate was per census tract?
Right, so we actually flip it. We'll publish the final response rate for local geographies. And when in 2010, we actually had a map that we would update that would actually tell you how your local census tract was doing in terms of the percent response. I'm not positive that we actually ever show what the non-response workload was by tract, but I could be wrong. But I don't think we go down into those types of reports. But the way to interpret the ROAM is to use it as a planning tool to understand what are those response scores, the likelihood to respond, and then figure out, okay, those are going to be the hard areas to reach. So I got to spend more of my communications resources between partnership and other ways to make sure that that population understands what the census is and responds. And then so many regional offices are actually coming up with track action plans. So down to the census tract, partnership specialists are saying, okay, here's the composition of that tract. Who are my partners that work or serve that community? How do I get them on board with the census? And that's going, as we scale up the partnership program to that 1,500 number, they're really embedded in doing that work.
Yeah, but just the follow-up. What you were saying, so there is a way to find out in 2010 what percentage of the census tract responded, because you had published that previously as a map.
Let me get back to you on that. I know that we published the final response rates for geographic governmental entities. We went down to the county level, and I think city levels were also available. But John? Aha! Okay. Yeah, that might have been the Google map I was talking about. So let me see if I can resurrect that and try to pull it together. But we will have a similar map that will have 2010 response rates on it that you can toggle back and forth between 2020 and 2010.
Linda?
So will you have these community-based organizations, will you have them on your website at some point so that we could find out, like, who our community-based organizations are?
Right. So one of the things I'm working on right now with the field division is to actually put out a visualization map of where the complete count committees are and who the contact is, so that we can at least align you with the local leadership in that community that is doing outreach and stuff. In terms of the local partnership effort, we're going to try to do the same and send you where are the specialists that you can reach out to or direct. Through email subscriptions also, as you sign up, we're going to, if you have questions, FAQs, things like that that you send us, we're going to send it automated to the right person in the region to actually help work that out.
And then one more that kind of completely unrelated. On the Title 13, when it was suspended during World War II, was that did that allow the government to know where the Japanese were to intern them?
Margot is probably the best person to answer that, and she's stepped out of the room, so I'm going to just ask for that one to be held. Pardon me? I thought that was a no-brainer. Well, but the respondent is not in the room, so I'm going to just hold on.
I will say, just from working that issue, and we get it every census. I got it in 2000, I got it in 20. Margot's the expert, but I will say that the block level data was used. There was Japanese internment, and we've had to talk. Bob actually sent out a statement during the 2010 census. There's Margot. Perfect timing.
Margot, the Japanese internment question came up, and did that violate Title 13?
Again, Title
13 wasn't
13, this is really complicated. Remember I said that the Congress repealed the provision of Title 13, the confidentiality provision in the Second War Powers Act. I have a slide with the actual legal language if anybody wants to see it, or you can contact me. The devil is in the details because the actual evacuation used small area data, not microdata. And there is, and so there's an ambiguity there over whether very, very fine-grained, in that case, enumeration district data was generated harm toward that population.
This would now be illegal under
It would be illegal, yes.
Would it, I'm going to stick to the history.
Yeah. So real quick on that, as we're going to the next question, I just want to reiterate, this is one of those things that, from a confidentiality standpoint, that we expect a lot of misinformation about. People not understanding what the census confidentiality law, maybe spreading across social media that they shouldn't respond because it's going to be shared with another agency like DHS or others. And census will need help responding to that from not only the media but our local partners. Title 13 is very clear about what we can and can't do, and we cannot share information with our government agencies. But that will not prevent somebody to try to dissuade people from participating in the census for various reasons. And so we have to make sure that we're very clear about our message. But again, it's going to have to be the local community that understands that and carries it forward to combat some of that misinformation that we do expect.
And 4 more questions. Tara first, and then
My question was actually related to that question, and I'm still not clear on whether Congress can again repeal Title 13. Is there a possibility, is there a path for something to happen where there is no confidentiality because something has been suspended or repealed?
Sure. Tara, I think that's an excellent question. I will.
Yeah,
try
the
not
answer,
I'll
of
try
course,
not
is
to
yes.
I'll try not to answer it with a question, but Congress can pass laws.
Yes, right.
And so if they want to repeal something, they can repeal something.
But they also have to do it as a public process.
Right. The privacy atmosphere today is much different than it was during that time period.
Point out that the Second War Powers Act repeal was heavily reported in the media at the time. In other words, this wasn't a secret, right? It didn't happen behind closed doors. Everyone knew about it. I can give you New York Times reports throughout the whole period that this was going on. It was a different period and a different sensibility, right? Now, in the 70s and 80s, Americans looked back at their experiences in World War II and thought very differently, but not at the time.
Could the president declare a national emergency around something like this?
I don't know. I'm not an attorney. Yeah. Yeah. So John's reading. Only Congress can change laws, not the president through emergency powers. But I'm going to leave that to attorneys. That's not where I'm going. Yeah.
next one.
Sure.
So changing a little bit on the subject, we're going to the business side of things you mentioned earlier. So are there any criteria that for media buying that there has to be, there's a process that needs to be completed prior to doing that?
Yes.
And is the engagement directly with Y&R, or is there some other level or structure involved?
James. So yes, so it is a very formal process. It's an acquisition process. It's a request for proposal that goes from you as a business organization directly to Y&R, and they evaluate the criteria. They will have a format on how to have that. They will, this media vendor day that they're going to announce, which I believe is April 3rd, if I'm not mistaken, will be very public to where you can ask questions and find out more and more information. But it will be on our website as a press release where you can go and see, okay, here's where I go for various information.
Okay, 2 more questions, and then we really need to move on.
Are you aware of any grants for independent journalists and media projects to be able to report the packages on the census?
I'm not personally aware of any specific detailing directly that. I will say, though, that philanthropic organizations have been formulating, trying to get grants from different foundations to set up different things like you're talking about. So I would certainly, the Census Funder Project is certainly one of them that is heavily organized right now. Karen Narsaki leads that, but we can talk about, I know John has had some interaction with some organizations as well. No federal money. But no federal money at this point, yes.
Thanks for this, Stephen. I just want to follow up on this because I'm very curious. Are you prepared? Are you ready? Do you have an ability to combat online fake kind of polling that looks like it's the census, or Russian? I'm not kidding here. Actually, Russian bots kind of going in with like, oh, and then somebody says, oh, I did that. I did the census, but they're actually sharing it with somebody, and then that data gets out there because they thought they actually the actual census.
Yeah. So I'm not going to punt that one to the CIO. I'm actually going to take it because he'd probably throw it back to me anyway. But we might be able to answer it a little bit together. So from an IT standpoint, Kevin and his team have been working with the federal intelligence community in terms of the cybersecurity type stuff, as well as the Department of Commerce, as well as with private sector tech companies to have the best practices in place to make sure it is safe and secure and encrypted when you respond to the census. So he is really concentrating on once that data comes to us, it is absolutely secure. What your question also gets at is either nation state attacks or other organized disinformation, misinformation campaigns, similar to some of the things that some have reported on from the election, from different elections, right? And so we're tackling that in a couple different ways. So we are working with tech partners and have for the last several years to talk to them about how their platforms could help us make sure that the factual information gets out to the people and knocks down any misinformation. So we're definitely in talks with them. This includes everybody from Microsoft to Facebook to Twitter to you name it, we're working with them. And then we're also trying to understand how do we see and detect as much information before it becomes an issue, right? So we will be monitoring not only response rates, but we're going to have communications feeds coming in showing us what is the social media conversation going on around the census? Is it spiking in one area or not? Is there some black hat search optimization that's going on that's trying to game the search algorithms that is sending up a false statement about the census and trying to lower that response rate? So we are actually looking at that very closely. We're working closely with our IT partners, and we have the tech partners ready to come to the table. They are aware, and they are going to work with us on making sure that their platforms aren't used for misinformation, disinformation campaigns while protecting First Amendment rights, obviously, for somebody to have an opinion. So we are working with them. It is an exciting part in the sense, but we always have, even in the 2010 census, when misinformation and disinformation wasn't really even talked about, I can't tell you the number of times we had to try to deal with somebody that was just misinformed and saying that your census information would be shared because they truly just thought that. And so we'd have to work to get to that person. Some of them have been members, elected officials in very high bodies that we would have to correct. It's shocking, but it does occur. So again, most of the time we can do some of this, but what we're really focused on is how do we make the mass scale of phishing, which will need your help. You know, how do you know it's an official census website that you're going to respond to without giving somebody that might be trying to game the system sinkholing of data, setting up a separate website, thinking that you filled out your census, but it never even comes to us. Not that they want your data, because the data we're collecting, again, is not that really, you know, from an information standpoint, isn't that valuable compared to the other information out there about you on digital properties and third-party websites. So again, we're working on it. We are going to have an announcement out. Some of the tech companies we're working with, we are doing a Facebook convening with community organizations coming up here later in March to sort of teach them and about how best to use Twitter and Facebook and Google to help them in their outreach. So that's a partnership we're doing with Facebook and the other tech companies. So there's a lot of steps we're going to be taking and probably announcing a little bit later, including a really big one with Microsoft.